Mr. President, earlier this year, Congress created a bipartisan committee, 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats, half from the House, half from the Senate. Their mission was to reform the budget process. It was an acknowledgement that our debt is climbing and there's no structure in place to even address that debt. And anytime our debt is addressed, it seems to be somewhat haphazard or accidental, or some ad hoc committee is formed to be able to go after debt every 10 years or so. This is spiraling, and we need to have something done, and it needs to be built into the structure. Starting in April, these 16 members of Congress started to meet with these instructions, quote, to significantly reform the budget and appropriations process. Significantly reform the process. The idea was simple. We're getting a bad budget product. We probably need to look at the budget process and to be able to find out what's happening with the process. See, this process that we have was started in 1974, right after Watergate. Congress created this new process with budget, with the president's budget, with authorizing bills, with appropriating bills, and they would all work together for great transparency. It was a great plan on paper. But since 1974, it has only worked 4 times. 4 times. And year after year, Americans keep saying the same thing. Why isn't the budget working again? Why is everything climbing? And every year, Congress says the same thing. We'll fix it next year, next year, next year, next year. And at some point, we have to admit it's a bad process, and we're not going to get a better product out of it. We have to be able to fix that process. So we started meeting. Today, we had our first set of votes on how we're going to significantly reform the budget process. We started meeting about 10:30 this morning, and after 15 amendments and debate, the hearing was suspended at lunch for a week because a few of the members wanted to fly home early for Thanksgiving. So now we'll have to finish that work next week. Signaled me again that we don't seem to be serious in this body about dealing with debt and deficits. That even the groups selected to reform the process couldn't finish debate without breaking early for Thanksgiving. So far, the only agreements to do significant reform, remember that's the mandate, the only agreements that have been set so far have been to do budgets every 2 years rather than every year, but still keep reconciliation and appropriation every year, change the membership of the Senate Budget Committee, and then to add a new optional bipartisan budget pathway in case some future Congress has lightning strike and they want to be able to try it. That's the only agreement that we've had so far. I don't know if that sounds like significant budget reform to you, but it doesn't to me. That sounds like just shifting things around. For months, we have researched the history of the budget process. We have identified different options that are out there. We've tried to figure out how we've gotten to this unworkable spot of budget deficits that we're in and how to fix it. For months, we've worked on this. And then as we got to this point, suddenly everyone starts backing up into the status quo and saying, we'll just try harder again. This will not work to just try harder. The process has to change. You see, we met with the leadership of the Congressional Budget Office and asked some very blunt questions about our debt and deficit that Americans inherently know and they can just feel it. But we asked the simple, straightforward numbers. The Congressional Budget Office reported back to us that if we want to get back to the historic levels of debt and deficit that we have had for the past 50 years, if we want to just get to that level, we will have to start cutting or taxing $630 billion every year starting in 2019 to just get back to the historic levels that we've been at. If we want to just stay at this level of debt to GDP, just remain in this position that we're in right now of overwhelming debt, we will have to cut or tax an additional $400 billion every single year just to tread water. The reason for that is our interest rates are continuing to go up, and on $21 trillion in total debt right now, as our interest rates tick back up, we will be soon approaching $1 trillion in interest payments each year. That is more than all of our discretionary spending combined. When people ask the question, why is the debt increasing suddenly? And they look at things like the tax bill and say, is that the tax bill? No, it's not the tax bill from last year. In fact, the tax bill from last year and the tax changes that were made for this year, there's actually more revenue coming into the federal treasury this year after the tax changes than there were last year. Let me run that by you again. Everyone seems to want to blame the tax bill on the increasing debt and deficit. There's more revenue coming into the Treasury this year than last year, even after the tax cut, because the tax cut spurred economic activity. More people have jobs, more people are paying taxes, more people are making more money, they're paying additional taxes. So even with the cut, more revenue is coming in. It's not about the tax cut. It's about a skyrocketing interest on a $21 trillion debt. And there's nothing we can do about that other than begin to address it seriously. It has been predictable. CBO has seen it for years, and it's here. And the simple mandate of the Budget Reform Committee was to bring out a significant reform in the process so we could address this together. But so far, this has been one of the most frustrating processes I've had in my short time here in the Senate. Because most don't want to solve it. Because the decisions will be hard. So let me lay out some of the options I think do fix this. What are some of the hard choices? The first thing that I've heard over and over and over again in this budget reform process is we need to get to a bipartisan process, and I agree. Republicans and Democrats alike are going to have to look at the debt and deficit and say we've got to be able to work together. So there seems to be all these different gimmicks for how we're going to try to work together when we're avoiding the one simple way. There is one simple way to be able to make sure that we do things bipartisan. It's called passing a law. Right now, the budget, as it's done every year, is not law. The Senate writes a budget. The House writes a budget. Neither of them are actually passed as a law. The president never signs them. The president creates a budget, House creates a budget, Senate creates a budget, and then everyone kind of debates for a year, and then we get to appropriations and fight over appropriations at the end of the year because those are actually law. Well, here's the simple solution. If you want to avoid government shutdowns, if you want to end all of the end-of-the-year fighting, if you want to make budgeting an actual bipartisan process, there's a simple solution. Make the budget a law. Now, I know that may sound overly simplistic to people that are outside of this Senate body, and many people may think the budget is already a law, but it's not. It's not a law because then you can create partisan documents and debate it and hash it around for a full year, and then go fight at the very end of the year before the government shutdown happens when there's lots of pressure. The simple way to resolve this at the beginning is to make the fight about the budget at the beginning of the year, long before there's a discussion of government shutdowns. Make the budget itself a law. Push the House and the Senate and the White House to sit down early in the year, before May 31. Resolve how we're going to spend, what we're going to do, what is the plan, what are we going to save, and then pass it as a law. When that happens, then all the work can happen after that. Then you do all the appropriation bills. Then you talk about what you're going to save. Then you fight through all the details of it, but you've established the big deal. That takes away the fight at the end and moves the fight to the beginning. But for some reason, most everyone on this committee is fighting with the one simple, obvious answer. Make the budget a law instead of a partisan political document every year. That has not worked. Let's fight it out early. We're going to have budget fights. We have disagreements in this body. Fine. Let's have our disagreements, but let's have them early rather than holding the entire country hostage at the end of the year, right as we approach a government shutdown. Let's lay out in the budget debt to GDP targets. Then we look at the gross domestic product, that's GDP. What do we produce total as a country? What's the total amount of debt that we can handle as a country? Let's create a plan for that in the budget, and then through the course of the year, actually execute that plan. It's what every family, what every business does. They look at what their revenue is coming in. If they've got debt, like their mortgage or cars, they plan in a lot for that. We don't. The budget is a political document, and then we make up spending as we go through the year without a significant plan. Make the budget a law, create your debt to GDP targets in it, and then execute those through the course of the year. Most Americans have heard something about appropriation bills, so they've heard that on some news report or something. The 1974 Budget Act requires we do a certain number of appropriation bills. Right now, it's 12 bills that are required. It breaks up the major parts of government spending into 12 little spots. Basically, we have 12 different bills set aside for spending. We never have a single bill set aside for saving. Well, let me run that past us again. There is no plan for a bill that is set aside for savings. So one of the things I've recommended, not only making the budget a law to force everyone to actually have the fight early rather than late, but to add a 13th bill. Do our 12 appropriation bills, but the 13th bill be a bill that's set aside every session of Congress that is focused on what are we going to save. Forcing Congress every session to have to stop and have the debate. How are we going to save money? What are we going to do? Each Congress can decide how much they want to save. But every Congress has to work a little bit on this. Currently, every time we fight debt, it may be once a decade big meeting on debt. We're never going to get a hold of $21 trillion in debt trying to fight it once a decade. We're going to have to do it little by little by little and chip it away. But this Congress, just like the last Congress, just like the one before, didn't do a significant work on debt reduction because there was no deadline and the work is hard. If I know anything about this Congress from the short time I've been here, it's that it will not do anything until it has to. So if we created in law a requirement that every session of Congress, there has to be this, what I call the 13th bill, this bill that's designed to say Congress has to debate how much they're going to save and where they're going to save, it would at least force that moment where we have to be able to resolve things. There's been no dialogue so far on how we really reform the debt limit. The debt limit only is an American invention. It was designed to be able to control our spending and control our debt, but I can assure you it has not worked. Since 78 times, we have raised the debt limit. The debt limit has become a debt cliff and a big fight, rather than something that actually controls our spending. If we would put in place something to actually cause Congress to have a vote on debt, I would be glad to deal with the debt limit. It's drama every time. And substitute it for something that's really going to reduce our debt burden. But that's not what the discussion is. The discussion in the committee is not about trying to actively reduce our debt or to put in plan a way to be able to reduce our debt. It's just what can we do to take out the debt ceiling vote entirely, because it is tricky. That doesn't help us. That's not significant reform, just removing something because it's tricky. Significant reform on our budget process is when we replace it with something that's effective. Every year, the President of the United States since 1974 has submitted something called the President's Budget. Millions of dollars are spent compiling this big giant document that no one reads. It becomes a big political document. Every single president has put one out since 1974, every year, and not a single one of them has ever passed. Not one. But lots of time and attention is spent on the quote-unquote president's budget. There is a simpler way to do this. Have the president turn over their priorities. Have them turn over the agency issues that they see on spending. It's perfectly acceptable for the president to do that. But don't create this big pomp and circumstance expensive process of having a giant president's budget that really means nothing? How about shifting our budgeting and our whole process to the calendar year rather than the fiscal year? Many Americans don't know that Congress runs from October the 1st until September the 30th. Well, guess what? It's the middle of November right now. Our appropriations are not done for this year. They're not done for last year. We've carried them over on something called a continuing resolution, or what you'll hear people say is a CR. Just like was done the year before, just like was done the year before, just like was done the year before. You see, Congress actually functions on a calendar year, but we pretend to function on a fiscal year. But it just guarantees that every October, November, December, we've got budget chaos as we're trying to figure out how to be able to run the system. How about this for a simple solution? Why don't we actually run it on a calendar year? Because that's how we actually do it, including this year. That would mean you could actually plan and structure for that. That's significant budget reform. But currently the conversation in the Budget Reform Committee is, no, we'll try it again next year and we'll see if we can make September 30th work. It won't, by the way. But no one wants to actually make the shift. There's been a lot of debate about something called reconciliation. Reconciliation is a process that's intensely broken. It was designed by the Budget Act to be something to really focus on debt and deficit, but it's become a fight with our parliamentarian and with each other about how to stick in something that's not debt and deficit related. Why don't we simplify the language? Why don't we clean up the reconciliation process? Why don't we make it what it was designed to be and make sure it's clear so that reconciliation is used by every Congress to deal with debt and deficit? It's a doable task. We've laid out multiple different proposals for how to be able to do that. So far, they've all been turned down. We've got to figure out a way to get better numbers. If we can't get better numbers, we're not going to get better results. We've got to get real numbers from the Congressional Budget Office and from joint tax. We've got to allow joint tax and other groups to be able to do dynamic scoring, and so we get a predictive way to be able to look at the spending and the tax and see what happens. We've got to have real consequences if Congress doesn't do a budget. Americans know if Congress doesn't do a budget, they just leave town and say, oops, didn't get it done this year. How about this for a simple idea that would be effective even today if we were doing it? There's a set deadline in statute, in law, when the budget has to be completed, when the appropriation bills have to be completed, and when they have to be signed. And if those milestones or deadlines are not hit, Congress cannot adjourn, cannot leave town. I don't care if it is approaching Thanksgiving or not. You set a deadline, and if it's not completed by that deadline, Congress has to be in session every day, including weekends, until it's done. That's a simple solution. Congress, if they're in session every single day, at some point they will say, I want to be able to go home and see my family. We need to get this resolved. I would agree. There's not a pressure point better than forcing Congress to stay in town and stay in session until the work is done. We'll see if that is actually added into the proposal. But so far, that's trending away from just saying to Congress in the future and now, no, we'll try to get that done, but I'm not sure that we really will. If we want to end government shutdowns, then keep Congress in session. If you want to end long continuing resolutions, keep Congress in session until it's done. It's a pretty straightforward process. It would benefit our economy. It would benefit this Congress. Even simple things. It's fascinating to me. There's an internal process called vote-a-rama. It's awful. If you're ever here in the Senate watching it or around it, it's terrible. It's around the budget process, and it's an endless debate vote, but none of the votes actually count. They're all messaging votes. They actually don't do anything, but anyone can bring up anything at any time. And we go through this endless series of messaging votes trying to make each other look bad politically. It's a terrible process. That's fixable. In fact, we brought up an amendment today in the process, one of those 15 amendments that was debated before people left early for Thanksgiving. We brought up that amendment today to fix the vote-a-rama. and it failed. Because folks on the other side wanted to have messaging votes just in case it came up. Interestingly enough, in the last vote-a-rama that happened, this all-night, perpetual, meaningless vote series, the last vote in the vote-a-rama was a messaging vote, should we end vote-a-ramas or not? It passed unanimously. Because everyone in this chamber says they hate it, but when there was a real option to get rid of it, they kept it. Because the status quo is easier than change. Significant budget reform was the mandate. That's not happened so far. Not even small budget reform has happened so far. We'll come back after Thanksgiving. We'll have another series of amendments. We have an opportunity to be able to get this right and to be able to fix a very broken process. And I would pray that over Thanksgiving, members of this body and of the House determine that $21 trillion worth of debt needs significant reform, not just tweaks around the edges. And that when we come back for Thanksgiving, people actually approach this seriously instead of the flippant way it's been approached so far. We've got to get this done, and I commend us to get it done. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.